Nathan never thought his life would unravel like this. The woman he loved, Izzy, became a victim of violence, and what followed would change everything. A pregnancy, a broken relationship, and the clash between love and belief. What happens when the future you envisioned is torn apart by forces beyond your control? Nathan had always believed in the simplicity of life's happiness: a steady job, a loving girlfriend, and the possibility of a future they'd build together. Everything changed the night Izzy came to him with a news that would unravel their world. In a voice cracked with emotion, she told him she had been assaulted. Nathan's heart froze. The shock was palpable, but it was the crushing sense of helplessness that followed that would haunt him forever. His strong, independent Izzy, the woman who had always carried herself with grace and determination, was now broken in a way he couldn't fix. What followed was a blur. Nathan tried to be there for her, offering what little comfort he could, but his own emotions were in turmoil. Anger, sorrow, guilt, they all collided in his chest. The worst part: he wasn't sure where to direct his feelings. He wasn't just angry at the person who had hurt her. He was angry at himself for not being able to protect her. As the days passed, he watched Izzy retreat into herself, no longer the vibrant woman he had fallen in love with, but someone lost and struggling to navigate this new, horrifying reality. Things got worse when they found out the unthinkable: Izzy was pregnant. The realization hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the trauma of what had happened, it was the child. A child conceived through violence, a constant reminder of the horror Izzy had endured. Nathan didn't know what to feel. He couldn't understand how anyone, let alone Izzy, could ever raise a child born out of such pain. Every day, the tension between them grew as they tried to figure out what to do. The unspoken question lingered in the air: what happens now? Izzy, in her fragile state, was just as lost. She wasn't sure what to do, but her faith told her one thing: she couldn't end the pregnancy. To her, the child was still a life, a soul to be protected. But for Nathan, the thought of fathering a child under such circumstances was unbearable. The gap between them, once filled with love and plans for the future, now felt insurmountable. As they sat together trying to sort through the mess, Nathan realized the overwhelming truth: he was unable to make this decision with her. His confusion and fear swirled inside him, making it impossible to understand what was right anymore. He wanted to help her, but the realization that they were now standing on the edge of a precipice was too much to bear. The tension only intensified as Nathan and Izzy debated what to do about the pregnancy. What started as quiet conversations between the two of them soon escalated into passionate arguments, the weight of their differing opinions bearing down on them. Nathan wanted Izzy to consider an abortion, feeling that it was the only way for her to start healing. To him, the idea of raising a child conceived through violence seemed like a life sentence, a constant reminder of the worst moment of their lives. He thought that ending the pregnancy was the path to freedom for both of them. Izzy, however, was resolute in her decision to keep the baby. Her faith and personal beliefs didn't allow her to even entertain the thought of abortion. She felt a deep spiritual connection to the child growing inside her, even if that connection was fraught with pain. To Izzy, this was a life innocent and pure, and despite the torment she was going through, she couldn't bring herself to end it. Every time Nathan mentioned abortion, it felt like he was asking her to erase a part of her. And as much as she loved Nathan, she couldn't let him dictate her path when it came to something so personal. Their conversations became increasingly strained. Nathan wanted to be there for her, but how could he be when he felt so strongly that this wasn't the right decision for them? The emotional distance between them widened with each passing day. The love they once shared seemed to vanish, replaced by a painful realization they could not agree on this. The future they had envisioned together, raising a family, now felt impossible. Izzy, in her brokenness, tried to reason with him. She explained that she didn't want to do this alone. She needed him, not just for the pregnancy, but for everything that came next. But Nathan, in his fear and confusion, felt himself pulling further away. He couldn't imagine a life with a child conceived under these circumstances. He wasn't sure he could even love the child, let alone raise it. The guilt and shame of walking away from his love for Izzy, of not being able to offer her the comfort she needed, gnawed at him. the night of their most intense conversation, where words were shouted, tears were shed, and silence lingered longer than the arguments, Nathan realized something: the distance between them was more than just a disagreement. It was a chasm formed by their different understandings of life, love, and healing. What would happen now? The days that followed were filled with unbearable tension. Izzy's thoughts swirled in a cycle of confusion, guilt, and sorrow. She loved Nathan deeply, but he had made it clear that he couldn't be part of a future with a child born of such traumatic circumstances. His stance was firm, and with every day his words echoed louder in her mind. Yet for Izzy, the choice seemed more complicated than Nathan could ever understand. She couldn't deny the overwhelming pressure she felt from within herself and her faith. To her, the child was still a life, a gift from God, regardless of how it was conceived. The thought of ending the pregnancy didn't align with the core of her beliefs. The decision to terminate a pregnancy was a heavy one for anyone, but for someone as deeply rooted in her religious convictions as Izzy, it felt like a betrayal of her values. She found solace in the belief that no matter the circumstances, a life was sacred, and this child, though conceived in violence, was still a child. Nathan's view was drastically different, though. Every time he brought up the option of abortion, Izzy's heart shattered. How could he ask her to do that? How could he suggest she erase the one thing that, for her, symbolized hope, even if it came with a burden? She wasn't sure how she could ever forgive herself if she gave in to Nathan's wishes. But the more she thought about it, the more her mind was pulled in different directions. There was a part of her that wanted to appease Nathan, to take the easy route for the sake of their relationship. But every time that thought crossed her mind, it felt like a betrayal to herself. In the end, Izzy reached an agonizing conclusion. She couldn't have an abortion, not yet at least. Her decision was grounded in her spiritual beliefs, in the hope that something good could come from this disaster. She would carry the baby. But the certainty she once felt about that decision was gone, replaced by a deep sense of fear. Could she raise a child alone? Could she move forward knowing Nathan couldn't be there for her? The weight of this choice threatened to suffocate her, and she wondered if, perhaps, she had made a mistake. As the days passed, her family, especially her mother, became increasingly involved. Her mother's influence was undeniable, pushing her to focus on the right thing to do, the moral thing to do. Izzy tried to find her own voice in the midst of it all, but it was hard when everyone around her seemed so sure of what needed to happen. Izzy's mind was in a constant state of turmoil, torn between doing what she believed was right and what others were telling her was the right choice. Nathan didn't understand. He couldn't. How could Izzy, the woman he loved, make this decision? Every day, the thought of raising a child that wasn't his, a child born from such an unspeakable violation, haunted him. He didn't want to be a part of that life. And as much as he tried to support Izzy, offering her gentle words of comfort and advice, the more he did, the more the resentment in his heart grew. He was stuck in a position where he felt like the villain for not being able to support her. Every time they spoke about the future, the wound in his heart only deepened. He had already decided that he couldn't stay with her under these circumstances, but hearing her continue to talk about keeping the baby, about raising a child that wasn't even his, broke something inside him. What was he supposed to do? How could he support her in this when his own emotions were all over the place? How could he be the man she needed him to be when he felt like he was being torn apart? Nathan wasn't prepared to raise a child that wasn't his, and certainly not one conceived through violence. Izzy, meanwhile, felt more alone than ever. The decision to keep the baby had caused a rift between her and Nathan, but it also made her question everything about herself. She wasn't sure who she was anymore, or who she could turn to for support. Her family, especially her mother, had been insistent on her keeping the baby. They told her it was the right thing to do, that it was what God would want. But in the back of Izzy's mind, doubts festered. She had wanted Nathan by her side through this. She had wanted to believe that they would make it through, that they would face this trial together. But instead, she was forced to face the emotional turmoil of this decision alone. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that no matter what she did, she would always be alone in this. Even if Nathan stayed, the bond they had once shared had been fractured beyond repair. They weren't the same people anymore, and the thought of raising a child in the midst of all this pain felt suffocating. Still, she couldn't change her mind. She had made a decision, and she wasn't sure how to turn back. At the same time, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. He was stuck in a place where he didn't want to let go of Izzy, but he knew he couldn't stay. The man he once was, the man who believed in love, in family, was slipping away. The pain of losing her was almost too much to bear. But the more Izzy held on to the idea of keeping the baby, the more Nathan felt like he was being pushed away. Their future, once filled with promise, now seemed like an impossible dream. The inevitable happened one night. After weeks of arguing, silent stares, and emotional breakdowns, Nathan reached a breaking point. They sat in the small, dimly lit living room they had shared for the past 2 years, their once cozy space now a cold battlefield. Izzy was sitting across from him, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Nathan could feel the weight of the words he was about to say, the words that would change everything. He opened his mouth, the words jagged and raw. "I can't do this, Izzy. I can't. I can't raise a child that's not mine. Not like this." His voice cracked with emotion, but there was no turning back. Izzy's breath caught in her throat, the shock evident on her face. Her eyes widened, and for a split second, she almost looked as if she would protest, to beg him to stay. But she didn't. She couldn't. Deep down, she knew this was coming. She had sensed it in the way Nathan had distanced himself from her over the past few weeks. The once loving, gentle man she had known was now a stranger, someone who couldn't share in her decision, couldn't see a future with her. Nathan looked away, unable to meet her gaze. He didn't want to see the tears that were now falling from her eyes. The last thing he wanted was to hurt her, but he had come to realize that staying with her, pretending that everything could be okay, was not fair to either of them. It wasn't fair to Izzy, who needed someone to support her unconditionally. And it wasn't fair to him, as he struggled to reconcile his own feelings with what was happening. Izzy's voice was barely a whisper. "So that's it? You're just going to leave me now? After everything?" Her words stung more than anything Nathan had heard. It wasn't that he didn't care for her anymore, it was that he simply couldn't cope with the magnitude of what lay ahead. He had tried to be there for her in the ways he knew how, but the emotional distance between them had become too much to overcome. The thought of raising a child conceived in violence was too much for him to bear. "I'm sorry, Izzy. I just can't do this," he said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Izzy stared at him, her heart breaking with each second. She had hoped, so desperately hoped, that somehow they could work through this together, that they could find a way to make it work. But the truth was, Nathan had already made up his mind. There was no turning back. Just when things seemed like they couldn't get worse, they did. A few days after the breakup, Izzy, still reeling from the emotional pain of losing Nathan, found herself facing yet another nightmare. Her mother had always been a constant presence in her life, especially now when things were at their darkest. She had supported Izzy's decision to keep the baby, constantly reminding her that it was the right thing to do. But now it seemed her mother's involvement in her life had crossed a dangerous line. Izzy had been struggling with her emotions, trying to keep it together while facing the fallout of her relationship and the weight of her decision. One afternoon, as she sat in her apartment, her phone rang. It was her mother. Her voice, frantic and trembling, barely registered in Izzy's mind. "Izzy, I'm coming over. There's something you need to understand. You're not doing this alone, but you need to listen to me. There are things happening you don't know about." Before Izzy could respond, there was a knock at the door. She opened it, expecting to find her mother, but instead, 2 police officers stood in front of her, their faces grim. "Are you Izzy Thompson?" one of the officers asked. "Yes." "What's going on?" Izzy's voice was shaky, panic beginning to rise in her chest. "We received a call about possible domestic abuse," the officer explained. "Your mother called us. She's worried about your safety." Izzy stood frozen, feeling a rush of confusion and disbelief. Domestic abuse? How could that be? Nathan had never hurt her. Not physically, not in any way. She opened her mouth to explain, but the words caught in her throat. Her mother, in her attempt to protect her, had accused Nathan of something that wasn't true, something that Izzy knew in her heart wasn't true. But the officers had already made up their minds. They insisted on speaking to Nathan, and they needed to investigate the situation further. Izzy's emotions were a mix of anger, humiliation, and confusion. How could her mother do this to her? How could she make everything even harder than it already was? Izzy's thoughts raced, but she couldn't make sense of any of it. She felt trapped by the circumstances, trapped by the people who were supposed to care for her. This was the last thing she needed in the middle of everything else. The officers left after a tense conversation, but Izzy was left shaken. Her relationship with Nathan had already been torn apart, and now, with her mother's interference, she felt like her entire world was crumbling. She couldn't understand why her mother, the one person who should have been there for her, would cause this kind of damage. But the emotional toll it took on Izzy was undeniable. She was no longer just facing the fallout of a broken relationship, but the devastation of betrayal on all sides. Izzy sat alone in her apartment, the heavy silence almost suffocating. It had been a week since the police had come to her door, and since then her emotions had been on an uncontrollable roller coaster. The walls seemed to close in around her, a constant reminder of the choices she had to make and the pain that each choice would bring. She had always believed in following her faith, in doing what was right, but now, that sense of certainty felt like a distant memory. Every decision seemed to tear her apart a little more. She thought back to the conversations she had had with her mother, the way her mother had painted the path forward as clear as the right thing to do. "You'll be fine," her mother had said, over and over. "God will help you. It's what's right." But the more Izzy thought about it, the more the guilt weighed on her. Could she really raise a child that wasn't Nathan's? A child that, no matter how innocent, carried with it the memory of violence. Every time she thought of the baby, she was filled with a mix of love and dread. Could she give the child the life it deserved? The turning point came when Izzy, feeling more and more desperate for relief, went to see a therapist. The weight of everything, the breakup with Nathan, the accusations from her mother, the growing pressure to keep the pregnancy, was taking its toll. The therapist listened patiently, offering no judgments, but simply a safe space for Izzy to express the confusion and turmoil she felt. After much soul-searching, and the therapist's gentle prodding, Izzy realized something that broke her heart. She couldn't bring this child into the world in the way she had originally imagined. The decision to keep the pregnancy had been rooted in her beliefs, but it hadn't been rooted in her reality. She wasn't ready to raise a child in such a fractured state. The emotional pain of carrying a child conceived in violence, along with the reality that she would have to do it alone, was overwhelming. So, with a heavy heart and a deep sense of sadness, Izzy decided to have an abortion. It was a decision she knew would haunt her for the rest of her life, but it was also the one that would allow her to begin healing. She didn't expect everyone to understand, especially her mother, but she also knew that this was a decision only she could make. She could no longer live with the uncertainty, the feeling of being torn apart by forces outside her control. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small glimmer of peace. The procedure was as difficult as she had imagined, but as she walked out of the clinic, there was a weight lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, Izzy could breathe again. But with that release came another wave of grief. It wasn't over. The emotional scars of what had happened would take time to heal. In the aftermath of the abortion, Izzy was left with a profound emptiness, a kind of grief that didn't have a clear outlet. The healing was not immediate, and for weeks she felt as though she were drowning in her own sorrow. But life, in its strange way, continued. Her mother, though still struggling to understand Izzy's decision, offered her a chance to get away from it all. A camping trip, an attempt to give Izzy some space, to take her mind off the chaos of the past few months. Izzy, reluctant at first, finally agreed. She didn't expect the trip to be anything more than a temporary escape, a way to breathe again. But something changed when they arrived in the woods. The fresh air, the stillness of nature, the crackling of the fire at night, it all combined to give Izzy a feeling of peace she hadn't known for months. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to just be. Around the campfire, her mother sat beside her, and though the conversation was sparse at first, something began to shift. They started talking, really talking about the pain Izzy had gone through, about her mother's fears for her future, about the healing that still needed to happen. It wasn't a perfect moment, and it wasn't a solution to all their problems, but it was a start. For the first time since the assault and the pregnancy, Izzy didn't feel alone. As they hiked through the forest the next day, Izzy couldn't help but feel a sense of connection to the world around her. It was as if nature had offered her a brief respite from her pain, a quiet reminder that even in the midst of overwhelming grief, life went on. She still had a long road ahead, but she felt a small flicker of hope return. Maybe things could get better. Maybe she could heal. It was during this trip that she began to reflect on everything that had happened. The pain of the abortion, the betrayal of Nathan, and the overwhelming pressure from her family. It was all part of a journey she never expected to walk, but it was her journey nonetheless. And though she was scarred, she also felt a sense of resilience within herself that had been buried for far too long. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first found out she was pregnant. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a bad thing. By the end of the trip, Izzy and her mother had made progress in their relationship. And though the healing process was far from complete, Izzy knew she wasn't alone anymore. The journey ahead would be difficult, but at least she could take it one step at a time. After returning from the camping trip, Izzy felt as though she had stepped into a new chapter of her life. The sense of clarity she had gained from the time spent in nature, the conversations with her mother, and the decision to move forward without the burden of the pregnancy had given her a foundation to rebuild from. But rebuilding didn't mean that everything was instantly better. It was a slow, painful process. Izzy took some time off work, seeking therapy to help her navigate the emotional wreckage of the past few months. She was haunted by the abortion and the relationship with Nathan that had unraveled in the wake of the assault, but she knew she needed to face these ghosts. For the first time, she began to speak openly about the shame, guilt, and betrayal she felt not just from Nathan, but from herself. She had blamed herself for so long, carrying the weight of the decisions and circumstances that had led her to this point. But in therapy, she slowly started to see things differently. She wasn't to blame. She hadn't asked for this. Life had happened to her, and now she had to learn how to heal from it. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the pain still felt unbearable, when the grief of losing a child, a relationship, and so much more threatened to swallow her whole. But with time, Izzy started to find moments of peace. She rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried beneath the weight of everything. She went back to painting, a passion she had once abandoned. She reconnected with friends she had pushed away. Slowly, she rebuilt the confidence and self-love that she had lost in the chaos of the previous months. Meanwhile, her relationship with her mother remained complicated. Though they had made progress on their camping trip, Izzy realized that her mother still had a lot of her own fears and prejudices that needed to be addressed. Izzy had to set boundaries and learn to be honest about her feelings, even if it meant disappointing her mother in the short term. The truth was, Izzy needed to put herself first. She needed to grow, to heal, and to redefine who she was without the trauma of the past defining her. Through therapy, self-reflection, and the support of her few close friends, Izzy started to see herself in a new light. She was no longer just the victim of a tragic situation. She was a survivor. And with each day that passed, she was becoming stronger. The scars would always remain, but they were no longer the defining feature of who she was. She was reclaiming her life. Months passed, and though Izzy's heart still carried the weight of her past decisions, she had grown in ways she hadn't thought possible. The journey toward healing had been long and painful, but it had also taught her some invaluable lessons about herself. She had learned to forgive herself for the choices she made, for the mistakes she believed were hers to bear alone. And most importantly, she had learned the importance of owning her story, of not letting the past dictate the course of her future. One day, she found herself standing on the balcony of her apartment, staring out at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the horizon, and for the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace that was unfamiliar but welcome. She had made it through the storm. She was still standing. Izzy had decided that she was ready to start over. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she was stronger, wiser, and more prepared to face whatever came next. She had made peace with the fact that life wasn't always going to go according to plan. That sometimes things happened that were beyond her control. But the one thing she could control was how she responded, and she had chosen to keep moving forward. There were still moments of sadness, moments when the grief of what had happened threatened to resurface, but Izzy had learned to let those moments pass. She was no longer afraid of her own vulnerability. She had learned to accept herself, to embrace her imperfections, and to acknowledge that healing was not a linear journey. There would be setbacks, but there would also be progress. And as she looked toward the future, Izzy knew that the road ahead would not always be easy. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. She was no longer shackled by her past. She was free to live, to love, and to create a life that was her own. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Izzy's journey. And make sure to subscribe to my channel for more stories that dive deep into life's most challenging moments. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.